Hey everybody, Cody Menz here, doing a review for the E75 TS, which is a new Tier 8 German premium heavy tank that we're going to be finding somewhat exclusively in the Holiday Ops large boxes that you're able to purchase at first. Who knows if this tank will be sold kind of individually after the fact at some later date. But anyway, this review I'm going to get into some quick stats while you see some gameplay in the background of two battles. We'll do a little armor breakdown. And I'm going to be comparing this against the tank that I think it most closely resembles, which is strangely enough a very new premium tank itself, the M54 Renegade. You wouldn't think at first. Most people are probably going to compare it to like the Luva, the Tiger II, you know, other German heavy tanks. The closest German heavy tank at Tier 8 I actually think that this tank kind of lines up with, strangely enough, is the VK4502A. Even though it doesn't look like the tank, you know, this pretty much looks like, you know, a Tiger II. It's the closest resemblance, with a little bit of the Luva's turret front. The VK4502A actually is probably the closest tech tree tank to it, just because of the mobility. But anyway, let's get into the breakdown here of the stats. E75 versus the M40 or M54 Renegade and the VK4502A. Focusing solely between the first two tanks though, 360 damage per shot. 227 millimeters a pen, which beats out the Renegade by 1 millimeter. Key difference is the premium penetration is pretty huge. The difference here, 282 versus 254, and the DPM, the M54 beats it out there, which kind of makes up a little bit for that premium pen difference. But you know, more or less, the guns are pretty similar between the two tanks, but E75 TS loses out in damage potential in those metrics there. Now, getting into some more gun stats, 2.4 second aim time, 0.36 accuracy. You're seeing kind of a trend here, kind of similar to the 54 Renegade again. Only has 8 degrees of gun depression versus 10 on the Renegade, and only 15 degrees of gun elevation versus 20 on the Renegade. So, Renegade kind of beats it out here again. So far, the E75 TS only has that premium pen advantage and 1 millimeter of penetration on the standard round versus the Renegade. So it doesn't mean that the gun's bad, because the M54 Renegade's gun is really good. But do note that this tank, you're not going to be relying on the armor too much. I'll get to that. And it's kind of a mobile tank, you know, with a little bit of a pep behind its gun with damage per shot. Alright, moving on to the accuracy of the tank. So lower values are better here. You can see that the E75 TS, the on the move accuracy, tank traverse accuracy as well. So when you're moving the tank's hull, the bloom of your aiming circle is going to be much larger than the M54 Renegade as well. And even with the VK4502A, you have a worse value on the move accuracy there. Moving your turrets the same across all tanks, and your standard shell velocity on the E75 is a little bit better than the M54 when it comes to the standard shell, a little bit lower on the premium round, but they're not too much of a difference there. Now, getting into some mobility here, and we're going to get to the armor in between the battles here as far as the breakdown. The mobility on this tank, you know, it's kind of the nicest feature of the tank. But before we get there, like, summing up the gun stats, like, if you're comparing this tank's gun, which literally the closest comparison is the M54 Renegade, you're doing yourself a disservice if you try to compare it against the German tanks, because most of them do closer to 320 damage per shot. If you're not looking at, say, like the Mauerbrecher and so on and so forth. But this tank versus the Renegade, the guns are pretty close, but the Renegade does beat it out with the on-the-move accuracy, which is pretty important because you're going to be moving around a lot with this tank. But the overall accuracy, the aiming time, you know, virtually the same. And when it comes to like the shells and the damage potential, the M54 does beat it out there with a higher DPM, so that's pretty important to know. However, the E75 TS will be able to deal with heavily armored targets a little bit better, since it has that 282 millimeters of pen on its premium round, which is pretty darn nice. It's a pretty good penetration value for a tier 8 heavy, but unfortunately you are going to have to shoot premium rounds, which are more expensive, and with sandbox changes coming up, you know, they're going to get a little hit to them. So that's really in the advantage of the E75 TS, but overall the gun, if you're taking everything into account, and especially using standard rounds, the M54 beats it out there. Now, getting into the end of this clip here, we're going to kind of segue into the armor before the mobility, actually. I don't want to start that. And the armor on these two tanks, you know, you would think that the E75 TS would be a little bit better than it actually is. That's one big issue to kind of know about this tank, is the armor on it is not as good as you might think it is, and especially compared to the Renegade. You can see side-by-side comparisons here. The Renegade kind of beats it out armor-wise. Like, it has a few, you know, weaker areas in the lower glacis, but specifically once you start getting up to the turret and even parts of the, you know, upper hull are better on the Renegade. The Renegade just has that weak spot on the cupola, which is a very, you know, very weak thing to have on the tank, and is kind of the only thing keeping it from being completely broken. The Renegade. The E75 TS has a smaller cupola. However, once you get out of this mantlet that resembles the louver around the gun on the E75 TS, you'll see these two little, you know, like eyeballs in a way. It reminds me of the E50M, you know, since that has some of those on there. But more or less, these things are pretty weak, and they are actually weak spots. It's not just like some made up value. So you can get penetrated there, you know, if you're going off of the, looking at the armor viewers and stuff like that. I like this one in the game because it's pretty accurate. It usually doesn't mislead you, albeit it's in Russian. But armor-wise, the E75 TS is worse than a Renegade. It does have better side armor. When it comes to side scraping, it's a little bit easier, and especially with the kind of space armor on the side, that huge kind of space armor piece that kind of negates a lot of HE, HE, you know, stuff like that, and heat rounds. But all in all, M54 Renegade, I would say, actually beats it out a little bit in the armor department, which kind of surprised me. I thought it would be better. It's not to say you can't bounce shots, you just have to be really careful. And having 2 degrees less gun depression than a Renegade hurts it as well. Now, getting into some mobility stats here. Mobility on the E75 and the Renegade, pretty close again. Same top speed going forward. E75 TS 1 km/h faster in reverse. Specific power almost identical. Gun traverse and hull traverse are much worse on the E75 TS, which are pretty important if you're playing this pretty, you know, mobile and kind of moving around the map. M54 is able to not get circled as easily, able to snapshot people and get their gun on tanks a little bit faster. So keep that in mind. They're pretty similar when it comes to these values here, but, you know, turning your hull and turret a little bit slower, but still not that bad. Like, compared to the VK4502A, E75 loses out a little bit, but that tank's almost medium-like for a tier 8. Now, getting into another bit with mobility, terrain resistances. This is where the E75 TS makes up a little bit compared to the M54. Even though it has a little bit less specific power on the E75 TS, it has much better terrain resistance values. Again, lower values are better, and the E75 has the best out of these 3 tanks here. So it actually makes it a little bit more mobile than the M54 when it comes to the feel of the tank, so on and so forth, and you'll actually be able to just barely outpace it, you know, if you're going just solely off of the stats here with the specific power, top speed, terrain resistance. So that's one bonus that you do have. The mobility should be a little bit better on the E75 TS than the M54, which gives it, you know, a little bit of an advantage. Last but not least, as far as stats go, we have a little bit of miscellaneous. So hit points identical between these 2 tanks we're comparing. View range, E75 loses out by 10 meters. Same fire chance, and the shell cost a little bit higher on the E75 TS, but that's kind of splitting hairs, like 25 credits. But you do have a much cheaper premium shell. 400 credits, you know, it's a little bit larger of a gap there, so it's worth mentioning. But ultimately, like, we just had the M54 Renegade, like a marathon. A lot of people got it, a lot of people bought it kind of, you know, a little bit cheaper. Now we have the E75 TS, also the Object 703 version 2 with the 122mm dual barrel, you know, tanks, or tank coming out. This tank is still pretty good. Like, it's different than other German heavy tanks because it's really mobile. It's freaking fast. You know, it's almost more medium-like than it is heavy tank-like. Where at first, you know, you kind of think like Tiger II and like a mini E75, but it plays like, having played the M54 Renegade a crap ton recently, it plays almost identical to that tank because a lot of the stats line up. The visual models are definitely different, and the most important difference to note, like the E75 TS, it has less DPM. It is a little bit faster. However, you know, you do have to be careful when it comes to like the on-the-move accuracy values being worse than the M54, and also ultimately the tank really struggles with the armor. It has a lot of holes. You know, the cupola might be small, but it's still weak. As those, once people figure out the little like eyeball thingamajigs, the rangefinders, I believe they are weak spots. And even just armor in general, like even on the hull, it's without that eggshell shape on the M54, you know, it's a lot easier for people to pen you. You're gonna have to side scrape more. It is better at that than the M54, being able to side scrape and stuff, but it's not necessarily something you want to rely on too much because you're kind of like a mobile heavy tank. But it is there, and it is nice having that kind of side armor with the multiple layers, since you have that outer space armor, then you have tracks, and then you have the hull. And even if they're shooting high up on your hull, you still have at least that little space armor shield. So all in all, like, this tank, I think it's worth it to get if, you know, you're gonna buy the boxes anyway. It's gonna be a really good tank. It has a really high skill ceiling. Like, it's really fun to play. It's gonna be harder to play if you're just like looking for a generic heavy tank, and you know, this one needs like finesse as far as like positioning, getting people to shoot basically where you want them to. And all in all, kind of like the M54, but a little bit harder to play ultimately. Like, I keep making the reference there. It's because when I was looking through the stats of all other tier 8 heavies, this thing just basically screamed, you know, M54 Renegade. But anyway, like, I think it's a good tank. I don't think it's, you know, necessarily like you need to chuck a ton of, you know, money at it to get it. Maybe it'll come in the future, being sold as a standalone tank, even if they say it's exclusive for the holiday ops boxes. But ultimately, it's a good tank. Decent crew training when it comes down to it. It has the same crew setup from what I kind of looked at as the Luva, so that works for most German heavies. Not all of them, but most of them. And ultimately, you know, it's very different than what most people expect from German heavy tanks. I thought this was going to be like a more towards like the E75 than it would be like kind of like a really light heavy like medium S tank. But ultimately, performance-wise, it's going to be good, but I do feel like the M54 beats it out. It's not just because I love American tanks, but performance-wise, I think the M54 is a little bit better with the higher DPM. A little bit better when it comes to like the gun handling stats, even if it does lose out a pinch with the mobility when it comes to terrain resistances. And the M54 also has the 10 meters extra V range, which is pretty important for a tank like this. But anyway, you know, thank you very much for watching this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And ultimately, when it comes to the E75 TS, it's just one of two boxes or tanks in the holiday ops boxes. The other one being the dual barrel Russian tier 8 heavy tank, which, you know, a lot of people are going to be clamoring for as well. And yeah, good luck if you plan on picking this tank up. You know, at least you have a little bit of a, you know, insight on how it performs. If you don't plan on picking it up, at least you know where to shoot the thing now. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. Have a nice one. Happy holidays.